My daughter yelled, "Don't fight with my husband in our house. Shut up or get out." But she forgot an important thing. The moment is still sharp in my mind because it did not begin with shouting. It began with something small and ordinary. The kind of moment families pretend is harmless until it becomes a weapon. We were sitting at the dinner table, just the three of us. Katrina across from me, Peter beside her, his voice growing louder with every sentence as he talked about his day, about how everyone else was incompetent, how the world was full of people who needed to be put in their place. I did not raise my voice. I did not criticize him. I simply said, calmly and carefully, "Peter, maybe you could lower your voice a little." That was all it took. Katrina's chair scraped hard against the floor as she stood up, her face tightening in a way I recognized too well, and she screamed, "Don't fight with my husband in our house. Shut up or get out." The words landed like a slap, sharp and public, and for a brief second I wondered if I had misheard her, if my own ears were finally failing me. But then I saw the look in her eyes and I knew she meant every word. Peter did not shout. He did not need to. He leaned back slightly, folded his arms, and smiled at me with a thin, amused expression, the kind of smile men wear when they believe they have already won. Katrina was still breathing hard, glaring at me as if I were a stranger who had wandered in off the street. I felt something settle inside my chest then, not anger, not fear, but a heavy clarity. I had lived long enough to recognize the moment when a relationship changes shape forever. Peter tilted his head and said quietly, "You always do this, May. You walk into a home and suddenly there's tension. You have a talent for ruining families." His words were smooth, practiced, and cruel in a way that did not need volume to cut deep. Katrina nodded, as if he had spoken a truth she had been waiting years to hear out loud. I looked at my daughter, the child I once held through fevers and nightmares, the girl I taught to tie her shoes and balance a checkbook, and I realized she was not seeing me anymore. She was seeing a problem, an embarrassment, a reminder of things she wanted to forget. She crossed her arms and said, "We were finally having a peaceful evening until you opened your mouth. You always have to stir things up." There it was, the accusation I had learned to expect, that my presence alone was disruptive, that my silence was preferable, that my existence should come with an apology. I felt my throat tighten, but I did not cry. I had learned a long time ago that tears only made people like them more confident. If you are listening to this and your chest feels tight, if something in these words feels uncomfortably familiar, then you understand why moments like this matter. If you feel justice deserves celebration, smash that hype button and let us keep stories like this alive, echoing far, far away. Your support helps us bring understanding and love to those who deserve it. Thank you so much, and please keep listening, because what happened next did not come from nowhere. It was built piece by piece over years of quiet endurance. Peter leaned forward slightly and said, "You should be grateful we even let you sit at this table. Other parents your age end up alone because no one can stand them." He said it gently, as if offering advice, and that was what made it so poisonous. Katrina did not object. She did not defend me. Instead she added, "You always make everything about you. This is our house, our rules, and you don't get to disrespect my husband here." The way she emphasized our made it clear that I was no longer included. I wanted to remind her that I had not disrespected anyone, that I had spoken as softly as a person could, but I knew it would not matter. Logic has no place where contempt has already taken root. I sat there, hands folded in my lap, listening as they explained who I was allowed to be in their lives. Katrina told me I was negative, that I was draining, that I had a way of turning happiness into tension just by opening my mouth. Peter watched me closely, his eyes alert, measuring whether his words were landing, and when he saw that I was not responding the way he expected, his smile widened. "See?" he said to Katrina. "She does this every time, plays the victim. That's how she controls people." The irony of being accused of control while being told to shut up or leave was not lost on me, but I did not point it out. I had learned that confronting lies does not always weaken them. What hurt most was not the shouting, not even the insults, but the certainty with which my daughter spoke, as if she had rehearsed these lines in her head long before this dinner. She told me I was lucky they tolerated me, that I should know my place, that if I wanted peace, I needed to stop causing problems. She did not see the contradiction in demanding silence and calling it harmony. As she spoke, I understood something important, something I had been avoiding for years. I was not being rejected because I was cruel or unreasonable. I was being rejected because my presence reminded them of truths they did not want acknowledged, and rather than face those truths, they chose to erase me. I finally looked at Peter and said, very quietly, "I never meant to fight." He shrugged as if that settled the matter and replied, "Intent doesn't matter when the damage is always the same." Katrina turned away from me then, signaling that the conversation was over, that my feelings were irrelevant. In that moment, sitting at that table, I felt the last thread of hope loosen inside me. I realized I was no longer fighting to be understood. I was fighting to survive with my dignity intact. And as painful as it was, that realization was also the beginning of something else, something they never saw coming. Because while they believed I was powerless, I had already learned how much damage silence can absorb before it transforms into resolve. Before anyone decided I was difficult, before my silence was mistaken for coldness, I was simply a woman trying to hold a life together with both hands. I became a widow when Katrina was still young enough to believe that promises could keep a man alive. Her father died suddenly, leaving behind a stack of unpaid bills, a quiet house, and a child who looked at me every night as if I were the last solid thing in her world. There was no dramatic collapse, no neighbors bringing casseroles for months on end, only the steady understanding that if I failed, there would be no one else to catch us. I learned very quickly that grief did not excuse responsibility, and so I packed mine away where it would not interfere with what needed to be done. I went back to work as a bookkeeper, then as an accountant, because numbers were honest in a way people were not. They balanced or they did not, and if they did not, you fixed them. I lived by the same rule. I made lists, budgets, plans. I saved where others spent, repaired where others replaced, and said no more often than yes. Katrina did not grow up with lavish birthday parties or closets full of clothes, and I knew even then that she noticed the difference between our home and the homes of her friends. Other mothers baked cupcakes, shaped like cartoon characters, and hugged their children in front of everyone. I packed lunches that were nutritious and reminded her to bring a jacket. I did not know how to perform affection. I knew how to provide safety. I loved my daughter deeply, but love, to me, meant showing up every single day and making sure the lights stayed on. I paid every tuition bill on time, sometimes early, even when it meant taking extra work or skipping things I wanted. When she wanted to go to college, I did not cry or boast. I sat down and calculated how to make it happen. When she needed a car, I bought a used one outright so she would not start her life buried in debt. I attended her school meetings, asked questions about her grades, and expected her to meet the standards I set, not because I was harsh, but because I believed preparation was a form of care. Katrina learned early that I did not praise easily. Compliments felt unnecessary to me when effort was expected, and I can see now how that shaped her. She watched other mothers gush and applaud, while I nodded and said, "Good, now keep going." At the time, I believed consistency mattered more than enthusiasm. I believed that if she knew I was always there, words would be redundant. I did not understand that children often want their parents to sound like cheerleaders, not managers. I did not understand how much she longed to be seen as special, not just responsible. As she grew older, that difference widened. Katrina became acutely aware of appearances. She wanted to fit in, to be admired, to be the kind of woman people envied. I remained practical, quiet, unimpressed by flash. When she complained that I embarrassed her by dressing plainly or speaking too directly, I dismissed it as teenage sensitivity. I told myself she would appreciate my values one day. What I did not see was that my refusal to perform motherhood the way others did made her feel exposed. In her mind, I was not just different, I was a liability. Still, I never abandoned her. When she struggled, I stepped in without hesitation. When she made choices I did not agree with, I supported her where it mattered. I did not threaten to cut her off, did not withhold help to prove a point. Even when she married Peter, a man whose charm felt rehearsed to me, I stayed quiet. I offered help when asked, money when needed, and distance when requested. I thought that was respect. I thought restraint would earn trust. Looking back, I can see how my way of loving became easy to resent. I did not gush over Peter. I did not pretend not to notice his temper or his need to dominate a room. I watched, listened, and kept my opinions measured. To Katrina, who wanted validation above all else, my calm scrutiny felt like judgment. She wanted me to applaud her choices loudly, to erase any doubt with enthusiasm. Instead, I offered stability and honesty, and to her, that was not enough. She once told me, half joking and half serious, that I made everything feel heavy. I did not know how to explain that weight was what kept things from drifting apart. I had carried responsibility for so long that it felt like a second spine. I did not complain about it, did not dramatize my sacrifices, and perhaps that was my mistake. Because I did not announce what I gave up, it became invisible. Because I did not demand gratitude, it was assumed none was owed. By the time Katrina began comparing me openly to other mothers, the damage was already done. She admired women who were warm, expressive, indulgent, even when their support was shallow or inconsistent. I represented something she did not want to acknowledge, that love could be quiet, disciplined, and unglamorous. In a world that rewards display, my kind of devotion looked like absence, and so, without ever leaving her, I became easy to dismiss, easy to blame, and eventually, easy to treat as if I were less than I had always been. 12 years earlier, before the shouting became routine and before contempt learned to wear a smile, there was one night that changed everything, even though no one wanted to name it as such. Katrina and Peter had been married less than 2 years then, still performing happiness in public, still insisting that love meant endurance. I was visiting for the weekend, sleeping in the small guest room down the hall, when I heard raised voices through the walls. I told myself it was none of my business. I had learned that lesson well. But then I heard a sharp sound, the kind that does not belong to words, followed by Katrina crying out, not loudly, but in a way that came from surprise more than pain. I opened the door and saw her on the floor, one hand braced against the coffee table, her face flushed and stunned. Peter stood over her, breathing hard, his fists clenched, already shifting into explanation mode. He said it was an accident. He said she had provoked him. He said he was under pressure at work, that anyone would have snapped. Katrina looked at me then, not with anger, not yet, but with something like a plea, as if she wanted me to see it the way she needed to see it. I helped her up, asked if she was hurt, and she nodded no too quickly. Peter kept talking, filling the room with reasons and justifications, and I realized with a cold clarity that this moment would either be buried or it would be named. I had buried too many things in my life already. I stepped into the kitchen and called the police. When the officers arrived, the house changed shape. Neighbors came out onto their porches, curiosity traveling faster than compassion. Katrina sat on the couch, arms wrapped around herself, answering questions she did not want to answer. Peter's tone softened, his words careful now, crafted for witnesses. The officers warned him, documented the incident, and told him to keep his distance for the night. No one was arrested, but the message was clear enough. When they left, the silence that followed was worse than the shouting that had come before. Katrina did not thank me. She did not ask if I was all right. She turned on me with a fury I had never seen before and said, "How could you do this to me?" I thought she meant the shove, the fear, the humiliation of being knocked down in her own living room. But she meant the call. She meant the exposure. She meant the neighbors. She meant the way her life suddenly looked fragile from the outside. "You made everything worse," she said. "You made us a spectacle." Peter stood behind her, quiet now, watching as if he were learning something important. In the days that followed, Katrina stopped speaking to me unless she had to. When she did, her words were sharp and precise, aimed to wound. She told me I had betrayed her. She told me I had chosen drama over family. She told me that marriage was complicated and I had no right to interfere. When I tried to explain that I had acted out of fear for her safety, she cut me off. "You didn't protect me," she said. "You humiliated me." That was the first time I understood that we were no longer standing on the same ground. Later, when things seemed calm again, When Peter returned with apologies and promises, Katrina confronted me with the sentence that would echo in my head for years. "You made me look like a woman who couldn't keep her husband," she said. Her voice was steady, controlled, and full of something brittle. In that moment, I saw the truth I had been circling without naming. She did not hate me because I had hurt her. She hated me because I had forced her to see herself as vulnerable, and vulnerability was the one thing she could not forgive. From then on, the story shifted. Peter's shove became stress. His temper became frustration. His behavior became something to manage quietly. My call became the real offense. I was labeled dramatic, intrusive, destructive. When I expressed concern, I was accused of trying to break them apart. When I stayed silent, I was accused of holding grudges. There was no version of my presence that did not feel like a threat to the narrative Katrina needed to survive. That night taught Peter something too. He learned that I would not look away, and he learned how dangerous that could be to him. So he reframed me, slowly and carefully, as the problem. He suggested I exaggerated. He hinted that I enjoyed conflict. He told Katrina that I wanted control, that I wanted to make her dependent, that I could not stand seeing her happy. It worked because it gave her an explanation that preserved her pride. If I was the villain, she did not have to be the victim. From that point on, the double standard hardened. His actions were always contextualized. My words were always condemned. He was allowed weakness. I was not allowed truth. And every time Katrina chose that version of events, something in her closed toward me, until the mother who had once been her anchor became, in her mind, the one force that had to be silenced for her life to feel intact. Living with Katrina and Peter was not loud the way people imagine cruelty to be. There were no bruises to point to, no shattered plates, no scenes that could be described in a single shocking sentence. What there was instead was a steady erosion, a daily reminder that my presence was tolerated, not welcomed. I occupied the spare room at the end of the hallway, a space that felt less like a bedroom and more like a holding area, where my belongings were kept neatly contained so they would not intrude on their life. Every morning I emerged quietly, careful with doors and footsteps, already aware that any sound could be interpreted as a disturbance. The abuse lived in the words that were chosen carefully enough to be denied later. Katrina would sigh when I entered a room, roll her eyes when I spoke, or exchange looks with Peter that said everything without saying anything at all. If I asked a simple question, she would answer as if I were slow, repeating herself with exaggerated patience. If I stayed silent, she would accuse me of sulking. There was no correct posture, no safe tone. Every interaction carried the unspoken message that I was in the way. Peter perfected the art of quiet dominance. He never raised his voice with me. Instead, he leaned close and spoke just low enough that only I could hear him. "You should be grateful we let you stay here," he would say, his expression neutral, almost bored. "Most parents your age don't get this kind of kindness." The implication was clear. My shelter was conditional. My security could be withdrawn at any moment. When I looked to Katrina for reassurance, she would look away, busy herself with something else, as if the moment did not exist. Meals became exercises in restraint. Conversations would stop when I joined the table, then resume with careful references I was not meant to understand. Peter liked to correct me, even on things I knew well, interrupting with a smile and explaining basic concepts as if I were a child. If I objected, he would laugh softly and say, "I'm just trying to help." Katrina would nod, adding, "Don't be so sensitive, Mom." Sensitivity became my alleged flaw, the explanation for every discomfort I felt. Over time, I noticed how often I was reminded of my age. Jokes about my memory, comments about my hearing, casual remarks about how things were different in my time. These were not overt insults, but they carried a quiet dismissal that made it easier to disregard anything I said. When I disagreed with Peter, he would tilt his head and say, "Are you sure you're remembering that right?" Katrina would follow with, "You've always had a dramatic way of recalling things." When Katrina screamed those words at me, it felt less like an argument and more like a verdict that had been waiting years to be announced. "Shut up or get out," she yelled, her voice sharp and steady, as if she had rehearsed it in her head long before this night. The room went quiet in that peculiar way it does when something irreversible has been said. I could hear my own breathing, slow and even, and I remember thinking how strange it was that my body refused to panic. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at my daughter and realized she was not asking me to leave. She was telling me who I was allowed to be if I stayed. Peter did not rush to comfort her. He waited until her words settled. Then he added his own, calmly, deliberately, like a man tightening a knot. "Honestly," he said, glancing at me as if I were an object left in the wrong place, "if you disappeared tomorrow, this house would finally feel peaceful." He said it without anger, without cruelty in his tone. And that was what made it so devastating. It was not a threat. It was a conclusion he had already reached. Katrina did not object. She nodded slightly, as if he had articulated something she had been afraid to say out loud. I felt a hollow space open inside me, not because I was surprised, but because I finally understood what years of silence had been preparing me for. I saw myself reflected in their faces, not as a mother, not as family, but as a source of discomfort they wanted removed. In that moment, it became painfully clear that I was no longer being measured by who I had been to Katrina, but by how easily I could be erased from her present. I was not her mother anymore. I was a mirror, and what they saw in me reminded them of things they did not want to face. My first instinct was to explain, to remind Katrina of the years when it was just the two of us, of the nights I stayed up balancing accounts so she could sleep without worry, of the choices I made so she could have options. But those memories belonged to me now, not to her. I understood that offering them would not bring me closer, it would only give them more to dismiss. So I stayed quiet. I let the silence do what words no longer could. Katrina mistook my calm for defeat. "See," she said, throwing her hands up. "This is what I mean. You never say anything when it matters." The irony almost made me smile. When I spoke, I was accused of causing problems. When I stayed silent, I was accused of withholding. There was no version of me that fit the role she needed me to play. Peter watched closely, his eyes flicking between us, gauging whether this was the moment I would finally break. I did not give him that satisfaction. As they continued talking, justifying themselves, listing my supposed flaws as if presenting evidence, something inside me shifted. I stopped listening to the words and started paying attention to the pattern. They were not angry because I had done something wrong. They were angry because I existed outside their control. My presence challenged the story they told themselves, that they were kind, reasonable people burdened by a difficult old woman. If I accepted that role, everything would make sense to them. If I refused, I had to go. Peter leaned forward and said, "We've been patient long enough. This situation isn't healthy." Katrina added, "I need to protect my marriage." That sentence landed heavily because it reframed everything. I was not her mother in that statement. I was a threat to be managed. I realized then that I had been hoping for something that no longer existed, a return to a relationship where love meant patience and patience meant safety. That hope had kept me enduring small humiliations, convincing myself they were temporary. In that moment, hope became a liability. I felt an unexpected sense of relief wash over me. It did not come from being told to leave. It came from the clarity of knowing that nothing I did would restore what had already been lost. I no longer had to perform, to soften myself, to prove my worth. I did not have to argue for a place that had already been taken away. For the first time in years, I saw the situation without the fog of obligation. I saw it as it was, not as I wished it to be. Katrina waited for me to beg. I could see it in her posture, the slight pause, the expectation that I would scramble to reassure her, to promise change, to apologize for my existence. When I did not, confusion flickered across her face. Peter frowned, sensing a shift he could not quite name. I met their eyes and felt no urge to defend myself. I understood then that defending myself would mean accepting their authority to judge me. I no longer accepted that. Inside, a quiet decision took root. I stopped hoping to be loved by people who needed me to disappear to feel comfortable. I chose safety instead. Not just physical safety, but the safety of my own mind, the safety of knowing that my reality was valid even if they refused to acknowledge it. I chose to protect myself from the slow violence of being diminished day after day. That choice did not feel dramatic. It felt necessary, like stepping out of a room filled with smoke. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady. "I hear you," I said, not as an apology, but as an acknowledgement. Peter scoffed, clearly unsatisfied. Katrina looked away, already distancing herself emotionally. They assumed this was the end of the conversation, that I would retreat to my room and absorb the blow quietly, as I always had. They did not know that something fundamental had changed, that the part of me still hoping for reconciliation had finally gone silent. I walked back to my room that night with a strange sense of calm. The walls no longer felt like a prison. They felt temporary. I sat on the edge of the bed and replayed the evening in my mind, not to punish myself, but to understand it fully. I recognized the moment for what it was, not just an argument, but a declaration. They had drawn a line, and in doing so, they had given me something I had not realized I needed: permission to stop trying. I did not create trust in a moment of anger or spite. I created it years earlier. In the quiet aftermath of the night, the police stood in Katrina's living room and wrote down what they saw. That night stayed with me, not because of the neighbors or the warning Peter received, but because of the look on my daughter's face afterward, the look that told me she would rather rewrite reality than live inside it. I remember sitting alone a few weeks later, reviewing my finances as I always did, and realizing something I had avoided for too long. Love, without structure, was not protection. Silence, without boundaries, was not peace. If I wanted to age with dignity, I needed to prepare for the version of my future where my voice would no longer be welcomed. The attorney I chose was not a dramatic man. He listened more than he spoke. When I told him what had happened, I did not embellish. I described the shove, the police visit, and my daughter's reaction afterward. I told him I was not afraid of losing my money, but of losing myself. He nodded and said something that stayed with me. He said that planning was not punishment, it was clarity. Together, we created a living trust that reflected my values, not just my assets. It was established after the police incident, not as a response to revenge, but as an acknowledgement of reality. The trust included clear ethical conditions, written in plain language. Any beneficiary was required to maintain a relationship free from physical or emotional abuse toward me. Verbal expulsion, humiliation, or coercion were explicitly defined as violations. These were not vague concepts. They were specific, measurable behaviors, the kind that could be documented and verified. I did not hide these conditions. I told Katrina I had arranged my affairs and that certain standards mattered to me. She laughed it off at the time, calling me dramatic. Peter smiled politely and said nothing. They assumed, as people often do, that consequences only exist on paper until someone enforces them. I also asked my attorney about recording conversations. He explained the law clearly. In our state, one-party consent was legal. I did not need permission to record interactions I was a part of. I did not record secretly out of malice. I recorded openly, telling them it helped me remember. That was true. Memory can be manipulated when you are told repeatedly that your experience is wrong. The recordings were not weapons. They were anchors. Years passed. The trust remained unchanged, reviewed annually, adjusted only for practical reasons. I never added clauses in anger. I never removed anyone impulsively. I simply lived, observed, and documented. When Katrina and Peter told me to be grateful, I recorded it. When they suggested I did not belong, I wrote it down. I did not rush the process. I understood that truth, when given time, accumulates weight. After the night Katrina told me to shut up or get out, I knew the conditions had been met, not in a technical sense, but in a moral one. Still, I did nothing immediately. I did not confront them. I did not announce consequences. I called my attorney the next morning and asked him to review the material I had. He listened to the recordings carefully, his expression neutral but focused. When he finished, he closed the folder and said, "This is clear." There was no triumph in his voice, only certainty. A week later, he came to the house. Katrina was surprised to see him, clearly assuming this was about updating a will or some routine matter. Peter offered him a seat, confident, relaxed. I sat quietly, hands folded, and let the process unfold. My attorney explained that he was there to clarify the current standing of my living trust. Katrina frowned, already impatient. Peter crossed his arms, his confidence beginning to thin. The attorney read the relevant section aloud, slowly, deliberately. He read the definitions of emotional abuse. He read the clause about verbal expulsion. He referenced dates, times, and documentation. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He simply stated facts. Katrina interrupted, saying this was ridiculous, that families fight, that nothing serious had happened. My attorney held up a hand and continued reading. When he reached the conclusion, the room felt smaller. Based on documented violations of the trust's ethical conditions, he said, Katrina and Peter are hereby removed as beneficiaries. The words hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Peter stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Katrina stared at me, as if she were seeing me for the first time. "This is a trap," Peter said. "You planned this." His voice was sharp now, the mask gone. My attorney responded calmly that the trust had been established years earlier and that the conditions were clear and unchanged. Katrina turned to me, her face pale. "Mom, you didn't have to do this," she said. "We're family." I looked at her and felt no urge to defend myself. "I didn't do this to you," I said quietly. "I prepared for myself." That was the truth. I had not waited for them to fail. I had simply refused to ignore the pattern when they did. My attorney explained the next steps, the irrevocability of the decision and the legal standing of the documentation, Peter argued. Katrina cried. Neither changed the outcome. When the attorney left, the house was silent in a way it had never been before. The power dynamic had shifted, not because I had taken something from them, but because they could no longer pretend their actions were inconsequential. I stood up slowly and said nothing more. There was nothing left to explain. The trust had done what it was designed to do. It had told the truth when my voice was no longer heard. I returned to my room and closed the door, not in defeat, but in completion. The preparations I had made years ago were no longer abstract. They were real, enforceable, and grounded in logic. I had not laid a trap. I had built a structure strong enough to hold the weight of reality. And when the time came, it did exactly what it was meant to do. Katrina's voice broke the silence first, and when it did, it tore through the room with a desperation I had never heard from her before. "So that's it?" she screamed, her words shaking. "You choose strangers over your own daughter?" Her face twisted as if the pain had finally found a way out, loud and unrestrained. And for a moment I saw the child she used to be, the one who needed reassurance more than pride. But that moment passed quickly, replaced by accusation. "After everything I've been through, after everything I've done, you do this to me?" Peter did not move toward her. He did not put an arm around her or tell her to calm down. Instead, he stepped back, as if distance might absolve him. "This is insane," he said sharply, his eyes darting around the room. "This is all because you couldn't keep your mouth shut years ago." He pointed at me, his finger trembling not with rage, but with fear. "You turned her against me. You always wanted control." The words came faster now, unraveling into something raw and ugly. Katrina turned to him, stunned, as if she had not expected to be pushed aside so easily. "Against you?" she cried. "You said we were fine. You said she was just being dramatic." Peter's jaw tightened. "I said what I had to say," he snapped. "You were the one who kept her here. You were the one who let this happen." The shift was sudden and unmistakable. The man who once spoke of unity now spoke only of survival. He grabbed his jacket from the chair and added, "I'm not dealing with this. I won't be punished for her issues." Katrina reached for him, her hand hovering in the air before dropping uselessly to her side. "You're not leaving," she said, her voice cracking. "You can't leave now." Peter hesitated for only a second, then looked at her with something like irritation. "I need space," he replied. "This is too much." He did not look back at me as he walked out, the door closing behind him with a finality that echoed through the house. In that sound, I heard years of denial collapse. Katrina turned toward me then, her anger dissolving into something raw and frightened. "Mom," she said, her voice lower now, almost pleading. "You didn't have to do this. We could have worked it out." I watched her carefully, noting how quickly her words shifted once she realized the consequences were real. I did not interrupt. I did not correct her. I waited because I understood something she did not yet see. This was not about working things out. This was about facing what she had spent years refusing to acknowledge. "I didn't choose anyone over you," I said finally, my voice steady. "I didn't choose at all. I stopped enduring." The words felt simple, almost plain, but they carried the weight of every moment I had swallowed my own truth to keep the peace. Katrina shook her head violently. "That's not fair," she said. "You're my mother. You're supposed to forgive." I looked at her and felt a quiet sadness settle in my chest. Forgiveness had become, to her, a synonym for erasure. "I forgave more than you know," I replied. What I stopped doing was pretending that forgiveness meant accepting harm. She stared at me as if I were speaking a foreign language. For the first time, the story she had built began to crack. She had always believed that I was choosing principle over love, that I valued being right more than being close. Now she was forced to consider that I had been choosing survival over silence, and that distinction frightened her. The house felt different without Peter's presence, exposed in a way it had not been before. Katrina paced the room, her movements frantic, her composure gone. She began listing everything she had done for me, every sacrifice she believed she had made. I listened, recognizing the familiar pattern of bargaining. When that failed, her voice turned sharp again. "You ruined my marriage," she accused. The sentence landed heavily, not because it was new, but because it was finally hollow. "I didn't ruin anything," I said quietly. "I stepped out of the lie that was holding it together." That was when she stopped pacing and looked at me with something close to fear. She was beginning to understand that without me as the scapegoat, the problems she had blamed on my presence had nowhere to hide. The tension between her and Peter, once softened by shared contempt, now stood exposed. Hours passed without resolution. Peter did not return. Katrina sat at the table, staring at nothing, the reality settling in slowly. I watched her and felt no triumph. What I felt was a deep, aching clarity. This was the consequence of choosing denial over truth for too long. It did not arrive with fireworks or villains, only with the quiet collapse of a narrative that could no longer sustain itself. When I finally stood to leave the room, Katrina looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I paused, choosing my words carefully. "Now you live with what's real," I said. Just like I had to. I did not offer comfort she was not ready to accept. I did not promise reconciliation. I simply told the truth. As I walked away, I understood that her marriage had not cracked because of a document or a lawyer. It cracked because it was built on avoidance and reinforced by my silence. Without that silence, the fault lines became impossible to ignore. Katrina would have to decide what to do with that knowledge. I had already made my choice. I had stepped out of endurance and into honesty, and whatever followed, I knew I would no longer be the one holding everything together at the cost of myself. I did not stay long after that night. There was nothing left to negotiate, nothing left to explain. I packed quietly, choosing only what belonged to me, not because I was angry, but because I was finished. Katrina watched from the doorway, her face unreadable, as if she were still waiting for me to change my mind, to soften, to return to the version of myself she could manage. I did not give her that. I gave her silence, not the wounded kind, but the kind that comes after a decision has already been made. In the weeks that followed, I put the last pieces of my affairs in order. The trust had already done its work, but I wanted the ending to reflect the life I had actually lived, not the one others imagined for me. A portion of my assets was directed to a foundation that supports women escaping abusive homes, not because it made a statement, but because it made sense. I knew how easy it was for harm to hide behind closed doors and polite explanations. I knew how often silence was mistaken for consent. If my life had taught me anything, it was that safety should never depend on endurance. I also made sure a small but meaningful gift went to the neighbor who had once stood on her porch 12 years earlier, phone in hand, waiting with me until the police arrived. She never asked questions, never spread rumors. She simply showed up when it mattered. People like that rarely receive recognition, but they carry more moral weight than entire families sometimes do. It felt right to acknowledge that kind of quiet courage. Katrina called once, late at night, her voice tight and uncertain. She did not apologize. She asked questions that circled around the truth without touching it. She wanted to know if things could ever go back to the way they were. I told her gently that I was not interested in going backward. That conversation ended without resolution, but it did not haunt me. I had learned that not every ending needs agreement to be complete. Peter did not reach out at all. From what I heard, he framed the situation as an overreaction, a misunderstanding, an unfortunate consequence of my rigidity. He told people I had always been difficult. That did not surprise me. Men like him need a villain to avoid accountability. Without my silence to shield him, he found other ways to protect himself. It no longer concerned me. I moved into a small, quiet place of my own, nothing extravagant, nothing designed to impress. For the first time in years, I slept without tension in my shoulders, without rehearsing conversations in my head. The peace was not dramatic, it was steady. It came from knowing that I would not be told to shrink, to apologize, or to disappear. I did not feel victorious. I felt intact. People often assume that justice must look loud to be satisfying, that it requires humiliation or public defeat. That was never what I wanted. I did not need Katrina to beg or Peter to suffer. What I needed was to stop sacrificing my dignity in the hope of being tolerated. The satisfaction came not from what they lost, but from what I reclaimed. I reclaimed my sense of self, my right to define my own reality, my freedom from a role that demanded my erasure. There are moments, of course, when grief returns unexpectedly. I grieve the daughter I thought I had, the relationship I believed could be repaired if I just tried harder. But grief no longer controls my decisions. It walks beside me now, acknowledged but not obeyed. I have learned that love without boundaries is not love, it is self-abandonment, and I have done enough of that for one lifetime. On my last visit to collect a few remaining items, Katrina stood in the hallway, watching me as if she were seeing a stranger. "I never thought it would end like this," she said quietly. I met her eyes and felt no anger, only a calm certainty. "Neither did I replied. "But endings are not always failures. Sometimes they are corrections." She did not respond. Some truths take longer to settle. As I drove away, I did not look back at the house. It no longer represented home to me. Home, I had learned, was not a place where I was merely allowed to exist. It was a place where my presence did not require justification. That understanding came late in my life, but it came clearly, and it changed everything. If there is one thing I would say to anyone listening, it is this. When someone tells you to get out, pay attention, not because they have power over you, but because they are revealing who they are willing to be to keep their comfort intact. Katrina told me to shut up or leave, and in doing so, she forgot one important thing. I had been preparing for that moment for a very long time. I did not walk away defeated. I walked away ready, carrying with me the one thing no one had managed to take, my dignity, intact, and finally, my own. If this story moved you, if it made you think, or if it helped you feel seen, please take a moment to subscribe to Grandma True Stories. Your support allows these quiet truths to reach others who need them, people who may still be sitting in rooms where they are told to be silent. By subscribing, you help keep these voices alive and remind the world that wisdom does not fade with age. It deepens. And remember this, whether you are young or old, parent or child, boundaries are not cruelty, and choosing yourself is not betrayal. Sometimes, the bravest thing a grandmother can do is speak at last, not to hurt, but to finally be whole. Thank you for listening.